All right, then. I'll begin on the reverse count of three, two, one. Firstly, just a couple of things on what we see this debate about, is what we see this debate as being about, right? Because I think the fundamental problem we're going to base our stance on is the fact that any law based on religious grounds is likely to be bad insofar as it gives religious institutions the ability to exploit a large number of people. So, one, just on a principle level, we'll be talking about three levels of impacting, but then secondly, it has significant practical outcomes on your ability to get stuff like social change within society or your ability to make sure that people can access, right? And then secondly, we'll be talking about how we uniquely get better community formation on our side of the house. Firstly, then, right, on how any law based on religious grounds leads to significant harms. First mechanism under this, religion does not give you any form of opt out, which means that when you are born under the birth lottery in a situation when you have absolutely no control to the religion that you are born in, the only way in which you have the ability to get some form of autonomy back is by making sure that you're able to escape the structures that you are inherently put under. The problem being, people in a majority of the world lack the ability to opt out of the religion that they are born into, but then also the point where religion becomes a legal institution that is actively part of the state and actively has the ability to impose itself through that, your ability to opt out of like following religion at any particular point in time when it is legalized is comparatively less, which means you deprive people of the ability to opt out of religion. You take away their agency on a principal level. Secondly, we tell you the state has an equal obligation to all the citizens in a majority of cases. Insofar as there's the existence of majority religions and minority religions, these personal laws are likely to disadvantage certain religions and are likely to give certain groups prioritization simply by virtue of the fact that the structures under which you get these laws are inherently bad, which means the state fails to fulfill this type of obligation that it has. Thirdly, we just tell you on a practical level, it is very, very difficult for you to change these laws after the point wherein they are instituted, right? Which means that insofar as these laws continue to exist, stuff like just your ability to get any amount of social change broadly becomes significantly slowed, but also religious institutions continue to remain hyper conservative. Why is this true? Generally, religious institutions want to be able to satisfy the people who are already within the institution before they prioritize stuff like making themselves a group that cares about people who are not followers of the religion, which means they want to avoid stuff like backlash to whatever extent that's possible, which means that the church is generally unwilling to do stuff like fully supporting the LGBTQ community insofar as the historical messaging has always been LGBTQ bad, and therefore it's likely to alienate a large number of its existing followers whenever it adopts anything that is like coherent for like social change or social progression, which means that at any particular point in time, the only way in which you're going to get any change within these personal laws is via these religious institutions who are actively disincentivized to do so. By opposing it and by abolishing a large number of these personal laws, you're probably able to make sure that one, the church or like whatever religious institution has no incentive to do so, but then two, your ability to get any form of changes more broadly is comparatively better. Fourthly, we tell you the church exists as or just religion in general exists as an oppressive social force that you are unable to oppose at any particular point in time, which means it leaves no scope for exceptions. I.e., when say we're talking when say like Christianity talks about abortion, it is something that it opposes on a blanket level, where abortion, irrespective of the circumstances of the abortion, is an inherently bad thing, and it has the ability to be able to defend this, or it has the ability to push this messaging on a very, very broad level in society at the point where it gets backing from stuff like the legal system. Fifthly, we tell you religious personal laws are always going to be inconsistent to a large extent at the point where they give religious communities the ability to self-determine to a very, very significant extent, right? Which means you have the existence of non-uniform policies, which means in a majority of instances, people are simply unwilling to engage with the official state to the large extent, which means, say, if I have a child, I'm unlikely to go and say, get a birth certificate for this child from the state because I have separate laws which give me as a member of a certain religious community the ability to determine what I want to opt into and what I do not want to opt into. The problematic aspect here is this means that children and say this women in the society in general, which are groups that at no point in time, or just minorities in general, at all points in time, which are not sufficiently represented by religious institutions by virtue of them being backwards or conservative because of the mechanisms we already told you, wherein they're unlikely to opt into stuff like being coherent for social change, generally are unwilling to then access these types of rights because simply these are then things that they cannot access via the regular state, and religion is the only institution that they can access within their personal lives, which means on an individual level they are pushed to opt into this. Then sixthly, we tell you personal concerns are turned into public concerns at the point when you get stuff like personal laws to exist, right? Which means that the religious personal laws puts your own personal matters in the control of religious institutions. So in case you need to be married, religious institutions will always say, okay, you probably cannot opt into stuff like gay marriage, or okay, you need to have significant controls on where and how you get married at any particular point in time, which means generally, even in case these are issues that are entirely personal and only concern you on an individual level and should not concern the rest of the state or the rest of society, these become problems of religious institutions, which gives these religious institutions the ability to actively interfere in your life at all points in time. Seventhly, we tell you interfaith marriages and relationships simply don't happen, which means that already you're all on one level, you're just having your agency taken away from you, because this means that when each religion has their own ways in which they adopt marriage, or in which they have their separate traditions that are legalized at some particular point in time, which means that the religious institutions will always stand in the way of interfering in these relationships. Which means that in case you want to marry someone from a particular religion, you will always have to go through the religious institutions to ensure that you get married. Which means that in case you want to marry someone from a particular religion, you will always have to go through the religious institutions to ensure that you get married. Which means that in case you want to marry someone from a particular religion, you will always have to go through the religious institutions to ensure that you get married. Which means that in case you want to marry someone from a particular religion, you will always have to go through the religious institutions to ensure that you get married. Which means that in case you want to marry someone, you will always legalize it as something that religion has direct control over, right? Which is the final point in regards to the harms that it has, where by virtue of allowing for stuff like religious personal laws, you give legal legitimacy to the church, which means that it becomes a legal institution instead of remaining a social one, which gives it the ability to like actively and like with significant influence oppose any form of change that you possibly get on our side of the house. Why is this uniquely relevant and something you want to weigh very highly within this debate? Firstly, we've already told you the church likely has perverse incentives by virtue of the fact it prioritizes its ability to maintain stuff like a high membership or to retain the members that it has at any particular point in time. So it's always likely to act on that and act towards their conservative basis. But then secondly, we're able to tell you these impacts are very broad. They impact a very, very large number of people, which means there's a high magnitude of them. Finally, we're able to tell you at the point where you abolish it, you likely get stuff like better community formation. I'm just wrapping up now. When we tell you, firstly, it's probably true then that religious leaders can no longer use this as something to oppose other religions, because it's harder to use that as the line of messaging, because it's harder to prove that that benefits some religions over others. For those reasons, so very proud to propose.
Thank the speaker for the speech. Please note anything beyond 7 minutes 15 seconds won't make it to add a seat. With that, inviting leader of opposition to start the case of side op. You have the floor here.
Am I clearly audible? Hello.
Yep, you're audible.
Thank you. I'll take POIs after the fourth minute or the fifth minute, preferably from CG, and give me 30 seconds and I'll start my debate. Just one clarification. Please put your POIs in the chat. Do not interrupt me by unmuting. Thank you. I'll be starting my debate. 5, 4, 3.
Speaker, you're on mute. I don't think.
My apologies. I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. Okay, I'll restart. I'll start my debate in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Panel understand the world that has been presented to us in this debate. Though in countries with significant religious diversity, should the state push for abolishment of personal laws? And the case that the government is giving is very limited in its scope, because they fail to explain as to how exactly the benefits that they're touting are exclusive on either side, and uh, the harms that they're saying wouldn't occur just because the religious personal laws do not exist anymore. So my case would be initially based on rebutting the arguments that the government has put forward, and I'll go on to the uh, then I'll go to my constructors, wherein I clearly prove as to how the presence of these religious laws is effectively better in the long run. So, okay. So firstly, what does the government come and tell us? The government comes and tells us that in case that the religious institutions are present, they can very well exploit a large number of people, and therefore there is no opt out that is given. In case of uh, in case of in case of such religious institutions existing in society, we need to understand that in any functional democracy there are certain scopes up to which the judiciary is always present. So if you look at the parallel that they are presenting, if there is a law that is uniformly applicable to all people, who is the recourse in case of any conflict that comes up? It is the judiciary, and which anyway exists in case the religious institutions continue. Therefore, then the comparative simply becomes as to why is it better off for such religious institutions to exist and the judiciary to coexist with them? Because simply, if the law exists uniformly for everyone, like the government was graceful enough to actually concede that no law can be perfect, and therefore there will be a lot of lacuna because the law, no matter how well you frame it, would not be able to concur and would not be able to intricately align with the specific needs of each and every society or each and every particular religion. So therefore, the recourse will remain to the judiciary, and in the absence of any religious institution, the lack of clear understanding of such intricate needs of any particular community will lead to an ill-equipped judiciary that is not able to give you such effective recourses which might be catered to the particular needs, which will simply not happen if these religious institutions and these personal laws do not exist, which tell you about the cultural history that these religions and these communities come from. The second aspect that they brought to you is regard to interfaith marriages, which suddenly will, according to the government, increase if such a common law is brought about, and will are somehow not happening or are significantly more difficult in the presence of such religious laws existing. Herein, we simply need to understand that interreligious personal laws, although they might dictate the manner in which the marriage is to be conducted, interfaith marriages are usually a that simply a religion is not able to accept someone else from another religion to join, and that union is what is being opposed. It is not the manner in which that marriage will take place or the manner in which that marriage will go forward, or various rights that might stem. Although they might form a part of it, it is inherently a person's bias against a particular religion that will stop. So even if you remove these personal laws, the religion itself does not cease to exist, and that barrier is ever present in case of any interfaith marriage. Fundamentally, no improvement will be seen in case these laws are removed for the presence of a common law, a law that is common to all people. I'll take the POI in a minute. And moving on to what are my particular constructives here. 3 points that I will like to bring forward to you. What is the idea of what is the basic idea on which you will base a society? Is basically the curtailment of certain liberties in exchange for the community that, or the protection or the sense of state that you get in joining a society. That is the essential idea based on which any democracy is structured. And so therefore you have to understand that no matter what happens, when you give up certain rights, there will be a certain sense of imperfection that exists in any society. And yes, these religious laws might be suffering from such imperfections here and there. That is true, not a problem. But what does this do if the state suddenly comes forward and tells you that today, what we are going to do, we are going to actually target these personal laws that have been existing since millennia, and we are going to target the cultural identity? How does that look like? That simply looks like when you entered into a contract with your state for giving up certain curtailment of certain liberties in exchange for the membership of a state, there is a certain sense of autonomy that is given to you with respect to the rights that you're deciding to give up. What does this happen? How does this look if the state suddenly comes and starts attacking one critical aspect? Because you've effectively given up the autonomy to decide as to what rights you're conceding to remain a part of that particular state. That is the autonomy. That is a critical piece of your autonomy that you're losing. What is the second aspect then this looks like? How does the state actually go about making this transition, or actually the state should push for the abolishment of quote unquote push for the abolishment of personal laws? How does that push effectively look like? Because the state now has a burden, or politicians particularly have a particular burden of convincing a large number of people that these particular laws are not good. How does that effectively look like? Because it effectively looks like a targeting, an attack on the sense of identity for every individual that exists in a very religiously diverse society, because they have learned to coexist over a long period of time, and now suddenly the politicians and the state that comes in, that is trying to effectively open up fault lines that they might have learned to mend over a very long period of time by effectively attacking the sense of identity. And how does the state effectively do this, and what kind of impacts does this have? These are the two constructives that I'll additionally add on. Because firstly, the state looks to target cultural identities, and it will look to open up fault lines, because that is the basis on which they will look to demonize certain minorities. So this is exactly the kind. Okay, before I go forward, I'll take that POI. 5, 4.
Why do you think universal law will allow it?
Okay. I didn't really understand what you meant by that, because at this point of time, what I'm telling you is the fact that the manner in which this state will go forward into implementing this push against abolishment of personal laws will simply look like the attack on identity of everyone who's present in that society, to look forward to and basically open up the fault lines that don't particularly exist, or not, or at least are not very much visible in that society, because that is exactly how they'll get a certain section of community to actually push for it. And ideally what this will look like is a demonizing attack on the minorities that exist. For example, uh, uh, if in India they will look to target particular communities, and they'll look to show as to how these particular laws are bad, or what kind of harms that they are causing on the larger scale. So this is how this state will actually look to push forward. And what kind of impact will it have, what kind of impact will it have on the social lives, is effectively that this changes everything then politics that revolves around. Because suddenly it won't be about, well, whatever welfare policies that the government might be looking to push forward, suddenly everything will be given up, because this is the biggest issue that will come up. And this will be on what the government will look to polarize and effectively push this agenda of actually abolishment. And what does this do? This erodes the cultural identity, this erodes the historical background that any community would have had before they actually at this point of time, over time that they build, the kind of cultural identity will be eroded. And thirdly and lastly, at this point of time, I'd also like to push forward that effectively, okay, wait, I think I'm out of time. All right, fair. I'm sure my book. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for the speech. Please note anything beyond 15 seconds won't make it to the sheet. Now inviting DPM to conclude opening government. You have the floor. Here.
Okay. POIs, please CO ask. It's very important we engage. Okay. I'll be starting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Just on weighing, nobody explains what.
1 second, because Shaurya has gotten disconnected right now, so he's just joining in.
Yeah, I also got cut there for a second. Chair, can you just confirm I'm audible and I can start?
Uh, yeah, you're audible. Shaurya, are you back? Have they connected again? Just to confirm.
No, they've not.
Okay, wait.
Sorry,
Now Shaurya is connected.
I have managed to come back. Sorry, I had a power.
Great. You're good to go.
Okay. I'll be starting in POI preference by chat. Okay. Thank you. I would ask for it explicitly most probably. Okay. I'll be starting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I don't care about cultural communities. I don't know why they are important, not important in this debate. We are not going to make this debate about divorce-based countries. We are going to make this debate about why all law based on religion bad, abolish all of them. We are making a broader claim. That is, we are staying relevant to the motion, but making a far broader claim. Don't penalize us for that. Three things that I would like to establish first. Firstly, on the principal clash. At all points of time, state allows you to vote for it. For instance, at the point when state makes a law that governs your personal life, you can later on vote for it and therefore exercise some agency in the making of that law or changing of that law. However, at the point when you are born into something and the religion governs that lawmaking, that is, to an extent, the state gives power to the religion to make the law or regulations or at least regulate your life. It takes away all forms of agency because there is no way you can change that. Means there is no opt-in, opt-out mechanism. In most instances, we should in the principal clash. But secondly, why religious laws specifically block opt-out? In general, when your rights are taken away, when someone treats you unequally, you are far more likely to have legal recourse and remedies. For instance, being able to go to the court and being able to go somewhere else. However, at the point when personal laws exist, they give power to religious institutions, but also codify these forms of discrimination as law, which means legal institutions are no longer able to give you remedy. Which means at the point personal laws exist, it takes away right to legal remedy from people who are facing discrimination from these laws. The difference is on their side of the house, religion would still exist and people would face discrimination, which is true. But to an extent, they would have legal remedies, but also they would have direct state support at the point when legal regulations aren't critically justifying these regulations. Okay. Third, international covenants like CEDAW exist, which means there are multiple international regulations and international covenants which specifically ask you to create uniform law for each and everybody. At the point when you are unable to do it, you face multiple international backlashes. A lot of international institutions criticize you, and a lot of media houses report badly about you, which means all these are reasons as to why you are maybe getting less tourism, but also getting less international aid from a lot of institutions who are asking you to create this change. Which means at the point when you have personal laws, firstly, this takes away tourism aid and everything else from you. But secondly, this is an additional incentive as to why you'd rather create good personal laws, or sorry, good laws at the point when the state is making it. But third, at the point when the state makes a law, it is far more likely to be challenged at constitutional court and everything else. Which means if you make unequal law, you are far more likely to be struck down, and therefore you are far more likely to make good laws. But also, apart from international pressure, internal pressure also exists. There are liberal movements, opposition parties who are likely to pressurize you to make good laws. Therefore, the state law is likely to be comparatively better in comparison to religious law. How do religious law operates? Firstly, it allows religious institutions to create subsidiary institutions in order to propagate these laws. For instance, it allows them to create madrasas. It allows them to create educational institutions specifically to the religion. It allows them to create specific ways of registering a marriage. This leads to multiple issues. Firstly, this creates administrative difficulties in giving rights. At all points of time, most individuals within religious communities aren't registered with the state. The issue is at the point when people aren't registered with the state, international human rights agencies cannot give them aid or cannot give them rights. But these are also people, when they go and ask for their property rights, because registration is not clear, they can't get the property from their father. But also these are instances like women whose marriage in and of itself is not registered. Multiple ways to assimilate people, but they do not prove why religious law specifically is the way to go, which means we have the exclusivity power, they don't. But more importantly, they claim that somehow the government would oppress minorities. Not true. There are multiple international institutions holding you accountable. International media exists, your own media exists, but at all points of time, minorities have their own religious institutions. You do not want a riot in your country because that takes away your economic ability to grow, but that also creates a bad international image, again causes all the harms. Therefore, you are unlikely to do so. For all these reasons, you are likely to create these laws in the best way possible. Does CO have a POI? Quickly, CO.
How do you ensure change in civil laws that are discriminatory?
Courts Second, a liberal government might come to place and change it, which means change is possible. On your side, it is not likely to happen. Anyways, three things that I would add to all of this. Firstly, at the point when you allow religious institutions to take control of your personal life, more often than not, they are likely to create oppressive force. Why? They firstly get most amount of funding from individuals who are in a position of power, for instance, men and everyone else. But also people in a position of power are also leaders of these like institutions, religious institutions, which means at most amount of time, these are individuals who are in power, but also people who are making sure that they remain in power, which means they are far more likely to push for their own incentive, and therefore they are far more likely to push for keeping the other community oppressed so that they can take advantage of the oppression that is created, which means at all points of time, individuals in power within these religious institutions are far more likely to keep others oppressed, and there is no reason as to why they would give up on it. But secondly, at the point when you create religious personal laws, there is no way to reform it, significantly because any reform committee has to have people within the religion. That is, you cannot come and say we reform Christian law without having a lot of Christians in the committee, which means more often than not, these are people who are pressured by their own religious community and everyone else to not reform the law, because a lot of people would be upset. So even if you have reforms, you have marginal small reforms which doesn't lead to any change. So even if OP can prove reform, they have to prove significant reforms that changes everything, which I don't think they can do, which means only on our side of the house you can have large scale reforms, which they cannot have. Three things that would take them down on weight. Firstly, things like cultural identity can be very easily resolved through national identity. That is, after in a long term, you might be able to overcome the culture you come from and simply give into patriotism and the nation that you live in. But there are multiple other ways to identify yourself, specifically in terms of the community that you build in your school and with your friends, which means identity in and of itself isn't exclusive, but also your ability to stay within the state or conflicts that you create is subject to the power of the state itself. So OP cannot come and claim that there will be riots or conflict, because state has the ability to stop that. State took out the entire 370 and could keep Kashmir in control, which was an entire big state. I'm not sure why they cannot keep some religious fringes in control. Last thing they say is that religion takes away your ability. No, through this, state doesn't take away your ability. Most people are willing for this, but the religious institutions aren't. We don't care about fringe elements. We care about people. Very proud to propose.
Thank the speaker for their speech. Now inviting DLO to conclude the opening half. You have the floor. Here.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, audible as well as visible.
Great. I'll take POI. Having said that, I'll take it. I don't know. I'll take it anytime. Just don't interrupt me through the voice channel. I'll try to take you once or twice, perhaps. I don't really have to see this. Starting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, start. When Narendra Modi says that we need to have a uniform civil code, he doesn't say that we need to have it because Hindu laws are misogynistic. He says that we need to have it because Muslims are marrying 3 women at the same time. That is because Muslims keep on overpopulating. We will tell you that why this specifically leads to demonization of minorities and is the law that creates polarization. I'll tell you that any benefit that opening government wants to achieve or presumably closing government wants to achieve have either already been saturated and achieved or will be organically achieved on our side of the house too. But this is important to note. Notice, this is not a debate which says this house would ban all religious personal laws. If this were, opening government case would make much more sense. This is a debate about this house believes that states should push, which means they have to defend the most likely way in which this is going to be pushed. And I'll tell you that the most likely way in which this is going to be pushed is likely to be one where you do this in a piece by piece way, which might seem like, oh, therefore there would be no shocks in the system. But I'll tell you that the laws that you first homogenize and make unionize are likely to be the laws of the minority, which is likely to leave massive trauma. This is what I'm going to prove to you by the end of my speech. Having said that, I want to do the comparative. 1. There are always secular marriage laws existing. There is opt-out, which means that you have things like Special Marriage Act, which means that if you are a Hindu, you want to marry a Christian person or so on and so forth, you can always go and opt into these particular laws. This is likely to exist in a religiously diverse country, because notice that vast majority of religiously diverse countries are empirically secular because of the reasons that Anshuman tells you in his speech, which is international media scrutiny, so on and so forth, which means that these laws are likely to exist because you have to cater to communities that are atheists or people who want to opt out of their religion, which which means that the benefit they are talking about are going to exist on either way, house sides of the house, which means that the religious opt-out is available to you. But if you're saying that you can't opt it out because there are tangible structures that are stopping you from opting them out, I'll tell you that these structures remain to exist on their side, but in fact become worse insofar as communities become more polarized and internalized on their side of the house, which I'll prove to you in a while. But two, there are constitutional structures that are always making these laws gender neutral, and this is not small impact, this is significant reform that keeps on happening. The reason for this is again analysis that Anshuman provides you in his speech, which is that there are constitutional courts within these countries who have to subscribe and like adhere to international norms like CEDAW, so on and so forth, which means that in large majority of countries, you have law, you have a community where you have a law, you have a constitutional code that has one basic ground norm, which is gender equality, so on and so forth. Any religious personal law that doesn't stand the scrutiny is likely to be taken out eventually, if not has not been taken out already. We think that any benefits they claim on that are incomparative, they don't exist. But third, having a law is not sufficient. This is about how much resources you dedicate to enforcing this law, because notice, personal law, unlike other laws, is extremely invisible, which means that how many, like your marriage or the way in which alimony is happening within your home, or whether or not you have divorced somebody using triple talaq, because even after triple talaq being banned in India, it's extremely prevalent within the Islamic community. The reason for that is because these laws are extremely invisible. Therefore, you need to dedicate police and dedicate resources there. Notice this debate is likely to happen in developing country. Why is that the case? Because you don't have empirically, you don't have such religious diversity in Europe. The simplest fact for that is colonialism. The reason why you have multiple religious communities simultaneously existing within developing countries is because this happened through colonialism, where one particular religion, which was not the predominant religion in these particular communities, was spread, and therefore now you have a religious potpourri, or you have exceptions like India. Having said that, I'll take closing comment. Go ahead.
When do you question whether you actually enjoy these personal laws? Who asks you if you're okay with triple talaq on your side?
You are right. Nobody asks you. But the problem is, it becomes worse on your side, which is where I'm going. Look, here is where the comparative in this debate. The point at which these laws are attacked by a government in name of a secular law, and I've told you this is likely to be done in a slow way, which means that you're not going to overhaul it, get a uniform civil code over the night, because this motion doesn't give them fiat for that. Notice that India is one of those countries who has actually been pushing for banning religious personal laws. That's uniform civil code, which is literally fucking written in the directive principles of the constitution, which means that this is being done in a slow way. The way you do this is by specifically targeting pieces of legislation, which is likely to be done in a way that you first target the laws that are belonging to the minority, which means that you're likely to create more polarization, but you're also likely to create more polarization because there is likely to be A, unequal prosecution, but B, disinformation. What do I mean by that? One, unequal prosecution. Just because you change the law doesn't mean that things change on ground reality. I think teams need to realize this, that in debates, the moment you change the law, it's not a magic wand that changes things automatically, which means perhaps bigamy is banned, but I could still engage in it if I could get away with it, because I told you that these things are likely to happen at an invisible level. Notice the state, insofar as it is likely to be ruled by a right-wing government, I told you this is likely to be a developing country within Asia or somewhere, which empirically have right-wing governments for simple structural are very common within these communities, which means the penetration of religious structures, by the way, OG analysis again, is absolutely common, which means simply because you change the law, you don't change anything. What do? You do two things. One, you polarize these communities more, which is what LO impact is, which means that you keep on changing election issues. Now, this this might look like a small thing to you from your liberal bubble. You might think that, how does it matter that certain marriage laws are changed? For certain people, these are questions of identity. These are questions which they in some way think threaten their very religious core, and therefore these are likely to become bigger issues, and therefore there's going to become more polarization. But two, this means that you're likely to move inwards as a community. Notice that after years of after years of reform, you have certain communities finally thinking about reforming themselves internally. The reason for that is they're finally willing to engage. You change that overtone window, which means that if I'm an Orthodox Hindu or Orthodox Muslim, I'm unwilling to send my daughter to the school anymore because I think there is a risk to my existence. There is a risk to my religious identity. You push that change back. On our side of the house, the change organically happens not only because of constitutional mechanisms, but also because religious communities have to reform because atheism is spreading massively. You need to reform, or otherwise they shift to more atheistic structures, specifically within urban areas. That means that the incentive to reform anyways, but also religions are competing amongst each other. For all those reasons, incredibly proud to host.
Thank the speaker for this speech. Now inviting member of government to start the closing half. You have the floor. Here.
Hi, am I clearly audible?
Yep.
Okay, I'll take at least 1 point from opening opposition. You can unmute and ask me. Okay. No one ever asks the Muslim woman if she agrees with the triple talaq because that question doesn't matter. The law is that she has triple talaq imposed on her. She doesn't have a question that she has to answer at all. So why would she look into it? The closing government case is simple. If you live in a community where you are surrounded by people who constantly tell you that there's a certain way of living life, you are being robbed of the opportunity to live a better life because you don't have the option to do something else. What is the closing government case? First, the push itself, because OO is correct, OG doesn't get to fiat that this will succeed, is important in getting people involved in political discourse from minority communities. Second, the push will probably succeed, and in the instances it succeeds, it heavily helps both the political benefits for these minority communities and the religious benefits. First, let's understand what exactly this push does. First, opening government gives you a lot of reasons as to why religions are bad. Opening opposition seems to not really question this. They just question sort of the method to change them. So let's assume that's the context we're debating in. What opening government then says is that these laws force you to follow them. But what we're going to tell you is that this is quite weird because opening opposition points out an important question. There are other ways to make you follow religious codes and laws, right? Like, presumably, the reason you don't have agency, which opening government asserts but doesn't mechanize, is because these people can take away scholarships that your children need to go to education. They can ostracize you from communities by not talking to you so you don't get married to anyone and feel isolated your entire life. They can also punish you in non-legal ways, in such as, for example, making sure you can't get employed at any ways and making sure that you are seen as someone bad by the community. So often it makes it easier to rob you because people don't want to report that crime to the police. But fourth of all, they can make you feel like you're going to hell. All of these are the mechanisms for opening government's first claim that religion is highly coercive, but they also highly mitigate their own claims as to why religion needs this law to enforce it. So I don't understand how those impacts work, but this also proves to you why religion makes it difficult for you to question it in the first place. What CG does first of all is explain to you how political religion forces you to stop questioning your beliefs. Why is this the case? First, note that historically religion is highly conservative, not just because of the reality of this situation, but because colonialism is used in countries with diverse populations to shut you up, right? You divide Muslims against Hindus, you divide people against each other, and so you go for the most conservative interpretation because that's the one that controls society the most. Because liberal interpretations allow people to question their rule, and that's not what you want from a colonial colony, right? But second, it's also hierarchies in developing nations where often if you're poorer, you have to listen to the people at the top, and so they have more power in order to enforce more restrictive rules. So historically, these laws are highly conservative. What does politics do to them? First, politics means that you need religious expertise to question the everyday life of your own, like, everyday community, right? So if you're Hindu, you can just ask a politician, why is it the case that I do not have the opportunity to divorce in a certain way? Or, for example, why can't I marry someone from a different religion? But if you're religious, the justification for that law comes from God, who you believe in for the reasons I gave you a minute ago about why it's coercive. Hence, you don't even think you can question it unless you have the religious expertise of scholars like ulamas or muftis who you think have the only capacity to understand these laws. Second, you cannot question God or the mufti, because if they claim a certain thing, then presumably you are going to be wrong more likely than not, because guess what? You could go to hell in the instances where you're wrong. This is a religious discussion and you cannot question them, because if you do, you're also risking your family going to hell. You're risking your own community going to hell. And the people around you hence tell you to shut the fuck up and accept it, because it is easier to take Pascal's wager, or in other words, it's easier to not risk hell than it is to possibly get a tiny change in your everyday life. The third thing is that the method by which you question these policies is also irrelevant, because it's the method of faith. Which one is more related to the Quran? Because if the law itself is religious, then presumably the justification is what God wants. So you look for answers in the pages of the Bible or the pages of the Torah or the pages of the Quran. And at that point, you cannot find justifications, because these scriptures tend to be conservative. And even if they weren't conservative, the justification of faith means that there is no correct way to interpret it other than to listen to the people above you. So the questioning method you go across, where you try to figure out if the scholars are correct, go back to the same scholars. Hence, you can never question it, and you don't want to get involved in politics. Why are personal laws so important? It's because they're the parts of your life that actually matter. It's how your inheritance works. It's how you communicate with your relatives and your wife. It's your everyday life in terms of what you can do to your children, what you can treat them like, what you can do in terms of family law disputes between you and some family member when you had an issue in your business. It's also disputes that aren't even just about your family, but about your business and everyday life. That's what personal law often relates to, like what is legal for a customer to ask of you. These are the things that actually affect you in everyday life, but you can't question them because they're religious. What happens on the alternative and you get involved with law? What are the impacts and why do you win? Opening opposition.
These are a bunch of reasons for why this is likely to be done in a bad way, which means the moment you start to push for it, this is why there is likely to be such massive backlash and more conservatism within these communities, which is our entire case.
No, Sid. So I described status quo. Now I'll describe the comparative. First, if the state says that they want to get rid of these laws, probably they're going to push in reinterpretations from liberal persons who actually support the alternative version of this law, which means that you get liberal mosques or liberal churches telling you that there's an alternative that you can agree with. Second, it often looks like trying to convince enough of the population of the country outside of your community. So you might be 10% as the Muslims. They might be trying to convince other Dalits or other poverty people who are poor to push you again, take that law away from you. So often it's persuasion to the rest of the community, right? At that point, the reason it's not subjugatory to the minorities is because the only way that these minorities could have had a set of laws that the majority didn't want is if they already had protections in the constitution. So often, if they have this kind of unique law system, they often have legal protections. But second, because they obviously matter in elections, because they were large enough to set their own legal systems, so you can't just abuse them. So third of all, because of the fact that if you have like a majority coalition with like minorities, they're also scared of the ways in which you treat other minorities. So if you harass Muslims, then Sikhs will be scared, and so on and so forth. What does this change? First, note that you have to fight non-Muslim people or non-Christian people in order to protect your own personal laws, which means that you have to argue not just from a religious perspective, but from a rational perspective, which means you platform arguments which are not just from your own religion, but from people all over the country or all over your community. But second, you also have to be aware of what other people are saying, because you have to respond to it. So you often understand the criticisms of your law. But third of all, it's crucial in terms of how much the political horse trading that happens makes it relevant. So you have to vote in the first place, because right now your Muslim party's always got the vote. But if you are now convinced that the Muslim party might not be enough to take care of you, and the majority does convince you that they can protect you with better laws, then you can vote for them. The impacts for this are three very simple things. First, you are more involved in politics, and hence you get significantly more protection, because as a bloc, parties now have to actually protect you from majority parties who might take your votes away. But second, you can interpret religion in your own way. This is the type of slow growth that both tells the majority about possibly good laws, but also tells the minority that there are other options. The impacts of this are extremely obviously winning, and Medhavini will give them to you. On that, closing government.
Thank the speaker for the speech. Now inviting member of opposition to start the case. CEO, you have the floor. Here.
Hi, am I clearly audible?
Yep.
Cool. Mehal going as member op. I just want to thank like GJ as DevSoc for rooting for me, my seniors, juniors, and I said this to like Rishit Kunal, and I also say it for like all my like debating friends. I think the real debate wins are the friends that you make along the way. Uh, okay, cool. Just one sec. POIs after the 5th minute, preferably from OG. Cool. Cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think religious laws talk about innately personal things to an individual, which means that they probably talk about marriage, family, how these institutions evolve, and what sort of roles do you play as like man or women or a child in these institutions, which means they strongly govern the sort of obligation that you have to your community and the way that these like obligations have evolved over time. We think that even if these religious laws are strongly codified and institutionalized, there's still scope for like differing judgments, differing precedents, or at least like slightly different interpretations and some sort of like disassociation from a very core base of a community. Insofar, we think that there has been significant changes in progressive moments over time, which is to say that institutions of family and marriages are evolving, especially in like the developing world where you see like nuclear families are becoming norms, like elders are like losing some sort of autonomy in like a joint family setup. You have like more people getting education, you have greater access to like broader liberal ideas, but it also means that you have women like in rural areas of like Bangladesh and Vietnam contributing to the economy by like taking up jobs in like certain factories or like taking up jobs in like agricultural areas, etc. We think because of all these notions, there's greater involvement of like ways that obligations are changing, the ways that you play different roles in like certain religions and whatnot. It's true that yes, there's a lot of difficulty in transforming these laws, but I also think that these things are becoming normalized, which is to say that most religions push against sentiments that are seen as anti-religious, which is to say at a point of time when women were like when women like had to like follow strong practices of not getting outside the house alone, or when they had to follow like even staunch ideas of what it means to like sacrifice your life for like your husband, and what does it mean to become a widow, etc. These religions went ahead and codified this sort of like social norm, etc. But we think insofar society is changing, there's a delta of change as religions might also evolve. What does this mean? It means that as institutions are becoming normalized, there may be like different precedents and differing judgments that may be passed by a lot of these individuals. Insofar, you have a really strong incentive to not alienate a lot of people who are part of this community, which is to say you don't want to alienate a lot of families who might never baptize their child in church, insofar they're progressive and they don't want like their child to grow in like an orthodox church. This also might look like a lot of people just opting out of religion, because opting out of religion is like is mandated in most secular states where you can shift, you can change a religion and whatnot. But I think on a more intuitive level, this also means that you're giving some sort of sanctimonious protection to stuff that matters a lot to individuals, which is ancient property. You talk about certain religious riots and then you go ahead and signify that, hey, like marriage can only exist if there's a certain number of pharaohs and whatnot, which means that there is like there's like certain community context and there's certain like practices which may not be preserved otherwise that religion tries to protect. Insofar, there's an onslaught of the way that policy making is shifting, and this is something that O doesn't capitalize on, right? O doesn't talk about policy making and why this is particularly true in countries where there's a lot of like religious diversity. One, we think religion influences a lot of voter banks, how policies and governance functions, but it also means there's a very few countries where a lot of religions exist in similar proportions and not in majority, which is to say India is a Hindu majority country, Bangladesh is a Hindu minority country, Middle Eastern nations have like different shares of like Shia and Sunni populations. This means two basic things. One, that most policies are either strongly in favor of certain religions or against certain religions. It means that there are certain like minority religions who are always feeling neglected, and their institutions, infrastructure, etc. are always, it's like always getting like de-recognized and is not recognized in most like majority states, which means Parsis in India get very little recognition for the sort of like unique religion they have and whatnot, which means it also like impacts the way education, propaganda, media, and entertainment plays out. At last, with laws, we're at least able to preserve certain sanctimonious elements, but this has like a simple impact, right? You get to maintain some semblance of protection for certain minorities because we think that this sort of implicit like law, etc., is less evident and less publicly provocative as other policy accommodations may be. This means insofar there's likely to be backlash by individuals when you go ahead and build like different infrastructure and accommodations, you can still ensure there's certain religions who are able to follow who are able to follow like their unique practices and are able to preserve their culture. But how do we weigh this on a comparative, right? I think Shaurya gives you a lot of good reasons to say, hey, like people can't back out of this like institution, etc. I think one, a lot of these like religions actually focus on deriving validity from your community, which means that hey, you will probably get married to someone from the same community insofar you have shared lived experiences, insofar if you're like a shifted diaspora, etc. A lot of unique experiences that only like two people from a similar community can share, etc., etc. Which means at some point of time, it heavily prioritizes your commitment to your community. This means that there is a lot of support for scholarly institutions and like whatnot, which strongly control this religion from the community itself. Which means we think that if there is an evolution in the general progressive standards of your followers, core followers, etc., there's likely to be a shift in how these institutions are held accountable and whatnot. But even when you want to go ahead certain religions, you have to prove on a comparative that the civil union will go ahead and recognize the sort of laws that you make, which is something that O also brings up, which is to say that we don't think the mechanisms that we get from CG or OG are good enough to prove that, hey, you're likely to have like better outcomes of like civil unions when you go ahead and integrate these practices or recognize these practices, which is to say, one, on OG, registration, administration, codification happens regardless, insofar most of your state regulates passports the way your citizen proof are like documented identification to literally avail government subsidies, ration, food, laws, and policies. Even to vote, you need some sort of citizenship. I think OG is out of this debate. But secondly, you need to recognize that mostly like states cannot separate religion from their governance and functioning, which means the very little accommodation that you make also goes ahead and actively clamps down on their like certain rights that they had over their property and whatnot. We think there is still a delta of change that we talk about that OO doesn't really go ahead and tell you. But at large, we don't think liberal organizations, etc., are likely to engage with all sections of the community or like the religious community, because different people may want different things. But there are certain norms that are becoming quite normalized with respect to like family, with respect to how mothers and their obligations are changing and whatnot. Those are the sort of things in which you can get some sort of widespread consensus, and therefore you can garner support. I don't think CG ever proves to you why this is unlikely to, like, why is it that you are likely to go ahead and have some sort of like accommodative law, whereas this state is also probably quite atrocious in nature and doesn't want to accommodate like different perspectives and whatnot. So what do we prove to you at CO? We prove to you that since religions gain their validity from communities and these communities are shifting, there's greater scope for like different judgments, different interpretations, etc. We think that there is like because of such movements, etc., you're still able to exit this sort of echo chamber. With that, proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for their speech. Now inviting government whip to conclude the case from side. Government, you have the floor. Here.
Yes, give me 1 minute. I hope I'm clearly audible. I'll take POI from opening and I'll ask for one. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think all houses aim for one end impact, and that's the value you derive out of religious institution in and of itself, and whether like participation of state ruins that, right? I think the problem, and this is the way that we solve like the deadlock on all the houses, is we prove to you that insofar there's no real participation of people among religious like issues, or no discourse that is created like within religious spaces, we don't think it's real participation. I think on op, and they never answer this via counterfact, like I'll deal with CEO's counterfact, at least on opening, is to answer that how like insofar these strict norms and going against these norms look like going against like God, why do individuals still feel like the capacity to go ahead and like engage with these norms, which is why we think they're likely to still remain very conservative. I think CEO's major push is that like society is largely liberalizing, which is why these norms aren't as bad. I have two responses. One, I think state is just from their own make inherently a better like actor to go ahead and like accelerate that process, simply because it's able to do this via legislative means. We don't think that happens on op insofar there's no accountability responsibility, right? But secondly, through Mehal's own mech, if politics and religious institution overlaps on such huge extent, we believe that certain parties within these countries are still based off minority issue or religion issues, which is why they still want to stick to this agenda. So if in their best case, even if some people are subjugated to these conservative norms, we still think it's a net harm. This looks like women who are not able to speak up. This looks like most of Indian rural India that's literally based off religious lines. Insofar there's high degree of polarization within these countries simply because religion is an important issue, we still think that certain Muslim areas with conservative ideas end up suffering, or minority areas that have been marked up in general still don't have penetration of these liberal ideas in and of itself. At best, then CO case ends up impacting a few individuals who probably influence. We don't see that this mech is enough to prove trickle down, which is why we think that their frame just doesn't stand. I think then from op, there are 4 ways through which we end up winning, right? Firstly, we prove to you that the threshold for individuals to go ahead and speak up is really, really high, right? We provide to you a certain and a unique way through which minorities will be able to fight for their own rights. I think on vulnerability, then what op proves at best is what is already happening in status quo keeps happening in slower level. What we prove to you on an alternative is that women get an opportunity to hear out of the viewpoints from liberal Muslims, and now that majority of Muslim leaders are required to cater to these women. We don't think that a specific accountability mechanism remains on their side of the house. Insofar state codifies these laws, there's now a pressure on these Muslim leaders to reform religion in of itself. We just don't think various interpretations on op world is enough to cater the harm that's already done. But second thing I want to talk about, that insofar there's a huge increase in political increase of minorities within political movement, it's a net good. Why? We think that politics are now able to take more secularized forms. Insofar we've proven that there's a large degree of polarization that happens status quo anyway. We think that not only now scholars or individuals with knowledge muftis etc take part in these institutions, but also common people who these laws end up in impacting by the end of the day, right? Which is why we think if OO's biggest concern is specific needs, I think specific needs are catered to better on our side of the house simply because you have real time discourse. But it's also important to notice that what would these Muslims look like, right? So insofar our minorities look at large, right? So we think that these are out of politics, but they just simply don't feel like they can change anything. This looks like certain compartmentalizations that are introduced by a religion that you just can't really escape. We think insofar this barrier exists, you just don't want to be involved into certain politics. Insofar this political involvement increases, it has massive impacts. We think the amount of voter turnout is likely to go up, minority parties are likely to feel more engaged within legislative process, but also we think that they end up forming a major voting bloc, which is why it then becomes very, very important for you to bring legislative change. The third thing I want to talk about is that if religion are something now that you're willing to question, there's more value that you end up deriving from your religion. I think now religion is turns to be more personalized insofar there's more communication with God, or more personal connections that you have. Insofar you don't have a religious leader literally feeding in what is right and wrong. Insofar there's compartmentalization of what is morally right and wrong. We don't think individuals are able to access that on our side of the house, right? And on their side of the house, right? On our side of the house, alternatively, insofar even if you still hold to certain values of religion but differentiate on others, you still have that individual space of questioning. We think this questioning becomes super important because it also have trickle downs on the way that you derive catharsis out of the religion. If religion is to be the be all end all in your hopeless situation, that only happens on our side of the house when you have that sort of autonomy in and of itself. I think this the way that we want to enter here in terms of why do we take it above opening government is to prove to you the exclusive link via which you derive this catharsis. I think opening just says that you have more autonomy because courts are better. I think that's not enough. We go ahead and prove to you that the crucial link which unlocks that impact in terms of why autonomy becomes important. But lastly, notice that the biggest problem with op bench in general is not proving proper counterfactual, right? So just one second.
I think that might be her family or her dog or something. So I hope you guys can pause the timer for a second.
Yeah, yeah.
So can someone tell me what the timestamp is? Has the protected time started?
I don't know what the timestamp is.
It's 5:20.
5:20. Thank you.
Am I audible?
Yep.
I think I stopped it around like 5:20, so sorry, it was my dog. Okay. Restarting in 3, 2, 1. The last thing I want to prove to the last thing we end up proving to you is that like on opposition, you have no chance of ever changing anything. On our side, at least we prove that like making politics a religious field means that there are alternative pathways in terms of like new information, etc. Before that, POI opening.
Your case is off clash because it's not a case for abolishment of religious personal laws. It's a case for reform in these particular personal laws using the mechanisms that you define. If these mechanisms work, they are not exclusive. I define them to you in my speech to engage.
I started my speech by saying that the link to any change is we are personalizing religions through participation, which is why we are on clash, because we're the only team who end up proving by having like civil laws is better for minorities if opposition's biggest problem is specific needs, which is why I want to bring like OO into this debate. I think the majority of the case rounds on specific needs, except they don't define two things. One, multiple views like within within the same religion, which is to say that you might agree to certain things but might not to like certain other things, which is to say that divide between like liberal Muslim men and women who opposed triple talaq on the very first place. At that point of time, they don't take the higher burden to prove to you why religious laws are in and of itself very inclusive. I think CO tries to skew this away by saying that, oh, there are like multiple interpretations that are available, but they still don't deal with the idea that the main like reason that these interpretations are likely going to be conservative is because they're there to maintain hierarchy and authority. Insofar this bottom line still remains, insofar you still want to assert religious identity via these laws, we don't think they're likely going to be more liberal on opposition side of the house. I think then they have to take the higher burden and prove to you that why it's still okay insofar that it's still like subjugating like certain sections within this like within the religion in and of itself. I think secondly, to like opening opposition, the reason we don't think that they're likely going to target this push is likely going to target minorities first is one is politics oftentimes is like just based on religion, right? Which is why like direct attack or backlash or opposition like backlash is specifically based on the way that like politics like happen within these developing countries, which is why often parties often like are based off minority issue, so likely call you out on this, which is why you're not going to do this, which is why we win on like two metrics. One, in terms of like vulnerability, we weigh off to you like why individuals who suffer most from these laws are likely going to have like a better leeway. But secondly, we win on gravity because we're able to prove to you why religion has impacts on all like on your personal life, specifically these laws. Insofar we're able to prove to you the better through civil laws we win this debate. Thanks.
I thank the speaker for the speech. Now inviting opposition whip to conclude this debate. You have the floor. Here.
30 seconds. Hi, I just want to check if I'm clearly audible.
Yep, you're audible.
Great. I'll take opening government. Do not unmute yourself. I will take you, I promise. Great. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. This is something about significantly personal things, which means succession, number of marriages, personal boundaries. It's not about the duties to the society, which means both OD and CG has a case that civil unions are better because they have the capacity to listen to everyone. I'm still unsure why governments or civil unions can't be oppressive to begin with. If we significantly prove you that improvement is happening, which means there is some level of evolution, I think OG is still like CG is still better in terms of thinking that change can happen. I think OG is really homogenized in thinking that all religions are really bad to begin with. I think I just want to disprove things like there is rural urban migration. I think the perspectives are changing. You probably have more laws in Saudi Arabia trying to permit more women to probably drive or probably increase their capacity to begin with. I think Hindu succession law is also trying to accommodate the inherent inheritance, which means girls can probably have more property from their family to begin with. I think there are significant changes in the religion doctrine that we probably see. But secondarily, religious movements do have an incentive to not sort of make their followers go away, which means the number of atheists that we have right now is because they're pissed by the religion themselves. What we really preserve on our side of the house is to take that sanctimonious value and never break that down. There are several incentives of the religious movement to stay intact, which means they do have an incentive to sort of make this progressive because they want to retain all followers. The reason why there's so many atheists because they don't like the religion. Sure, CG is right in terms of proving that they probably go back to scholars, but still we do not want to homogenize religion that they probably become so conservative that they don't allow any followers to probably speak out, etc. to begin with. I think this also looks like that people exist out of laws. I think there are institutions of family which are changing. I think the nuclear family becomes law. I think the way you probably have different things in context with religion is also changing to begin with, which means like Saudi Arabia probably thinks that the knowledge about technology is not seen as anti-religious because it doesn't threaten the way religious conscriptions have happened in the very first place. I think you really do not want to piss anybody within that religion to begin with. But I want to weigh on three things. First on time frame, second on scope, and lastly on the probability of things that are happening. First, I want to take out opening government. I think CG is start in terms of proving that opening government doesn't have the fiat to sort of prove that this thing will probably happen. But I think there are a couple of things here. First, they posit that it will satisfy the institution which genuinely cares about the religion to begin with. I don't think so that most civil unions are probably more acceptable, etc. to begin with. But there are three things then. First, I think they tell you the state care about the agency. No, governments can also be significantly back because they take back their agency of people that they think are really not that great for the society itself. The second thing that I really want to posit is the way religious institutions largely occur. In a society where there is a lot of religious diversity, I think there are a couple of things which are important. First, you will have policymakers, you will probably have people who become important stakeholders who are coming from that significant religion, which means like Israel has significant amount of religious diversity. I think Turks have different sort of religious diversity, which means the context of religion is really absent in most of the civil unions to begin with. I think there are significant assumptions of how that law occurs in the very first place. Two things then. First, I think it's really significantly important for you to weigh how laws exist in the society, which means it's often contextualized to make things look bad or good, but the context of religion is really important. Why is this really significant for a debate? Because we really try to preserve the way religions are perceived to begin with. I think most people can be against religion because they can probably be oppressive. But two things that are really important. First, I think more religion do not become oppressive. But secondarily, I think people do want to perceive their religion to be an important part in the society. But if we significantly prove that things are changing, which means religious has the capacity to change a lot of things, we probably win on magnitude at least. First, I don't think so people pray 5 times a day. I think this is significantly decreased. I think women in rural areas do have an agency to sort of do some work, which means they can take part in agriculture, etc. But three things. I think CG says right. CG is right in terms of proving that they want to include people in political discourse. But what is that point of the discourse that the individuals not feel accomplished by the way their religion exists in the very first place? The scope is this: how broadly are we impacting the way people feel in that population to begin with? I think you can't really abolish without upsetting a significant number of people, which means you take away that sanctimonious value of the religion itself. The two things then that are important. First, on why the credibility of the civil union is not that trusted by individuals who are part of that stakeholders, which means you probably will have a lot of scholars from that religion distribution, etc., who really value it in the very first place. But secondarily, how does that composition look like in the political diaspora? I think two things then. First, how do we preserve religious sentiments? Because in a state which is extremely diverse, you probably have stakeholders, you probably have governance structures, policymakers, the demands of the individuals who probably would want to revolve around that religion to begin with. You do not want to destabilize. This is really clashing with the idea that opening government has, that hey, you probably will have better civil unions because their policies are much more better. They will govern or give more agency to people, but they never prove why this will happen, and they don't have the fiat to sort of do so in the very first place. Secondarily, I think there's a majoritarian sentiment too, which means in Saudi, you probably will have Sharia law, Shia dominance. In Israel, you probably have Jews, but you also have Arabs. I think different people exist, which means majoritarian people on either sides of the houses would want to push religion out of it because they don't feel accepted by the religion themselves to begin with. But two things then. But before that, I will take opening up.
If government is evil and wants to oppress minorities, maybe they are doing it in 100 other ways. What exactly is your scale of impact then on alienation and oppression?
Significantly want to ensure on all sides of the houses to begin with. I think it's the most charitable framework that you really want to have. But answering OG's POI in terms of what is the scale of impact that we are trying to accept here, I think governments can still accept you, but there is a higher degree of chance that they have different priorities at all points of time, which means you have to have two things. First, if we buy if we probably like accept CG's idea that hey, everybody goes to hell, I don't think so that's significantly true. But then the time frame of the argumentation comes in. Is it short term or is it long term harm? Which means on our side of the house, if you try to infringe on somebody's religious personal autonomy, you're likely to infringe the policy making or the policies or the discourse that you're essentially having, which is still bad because people still have some sort of capacity in terms of involving their religious ideas at all points of time. It's a long term harm because you probably take that kind of discourse that they want to make just because they really like engaging in their religion because they have been born into it, etc. But secondarily, also take away the freedom to sort of involve their discourse in a significant manner. I think it's a really short-term like benefit on-side opening government. Things probably change. Why do we weigh on our opening opposition? Because we significantly tell you the nuance of what this sanctimonious valley looks like.
I thank the speaker for the speech. This concludes the debate. For I